Carmen Joy Imes is an incredible, legitimate Bible scholar, Old Testament expert, and author of the book Being God's Image, which came out just a couple of months back. And the subheading is Why Creation Still Matters. I went through this book on audio 3 or 4 times, taking copious notes, and I decided to just reach out and see if she'd be interested in hopping on and answering some questions that I had. She's done a BibleProject Classroom for them, a classroom class. It's 14 plus hours of content, and she might be the single person alive today who knows the most about Exodus. And it was a really wonderful conversation. There's lots of gold nuggets in here. I was really grateful for her time, and we even found out we grew up in the same hometown, and her thoughts illuminated a lot of what I was hoping to find when I opened up her book. It was really wonderful to speak to her. So without further ado, here's our interview. Well, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I'm going to I would like to treat this like a podcast, but it's not really. I just have so many questions and I wanted to record it. I don't even want there to be like an audience necessarily in the room between you and me, because I think that can lead to people being kind of weird about the way that they answer questions. I just want to know what you think about certain questions. I want to cover the book. I want to give you an opportunity to sort of like tell me where I can find more of your stuff. But I'm super grateful for your time and your willingness to jump on.
Yeah, you bet. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So there's a lot that we have in common. That was kind of an interesting, it was interesting for me to kind of discover these things gradually. I discovered you through Tim Mackey and BibleProject and sort of that entire, we'll call it like the Ray Lubeck tree.
Okay. Fair enough.
Which was really, it's been a fruitful tree. I'm going to break this metaphor down eventually, but it's been a fruitful tree for me to sort of climb into the branches and look for wonderful things to just find and enjoy. But then I found you on Facebook and friended you because what you were saying, especially regarding things like women in ministry and the importance of embodied physicality in the Christian life, those things were really resonating with me. And then I found out you're from Denver, I spent the first 17 years of my life there.
Oh, nice. Me too.
Which was really cool for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. What part of Denver did you grow up in?
It was Denver itself, like Colorado Boulevard and Evans, kind of where they intersect. Yeah, I went to Denver Christian High School, so.
For sure. That's kind of, like south of Denver proper, right?
Yeah, so now the high school is south of Denver, like it's in Highlands Ranch or something, but when I went, it was in Denver itself, so on the south end of Denver. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I love that area. I have friends definitely who lived in that area. My high school was down on, I went to TJ.
Oh yeah.
Down on Hampton.
Okay.
Which is right there.
Yep.
But I lived in, it's actually, I come to find out later that it's actually the most polluted zip code in the entire country, in spite of having pretty good air quality. Do you know that spot on, there's I-70, right? And then there's that spot where the Purina dog chow factory is. Like it's the part everybody drives past. Obviously you haven't been here for some time.
I know it's been a long time.
Biola.
Yeah.
But it was that part of I-70 where like the Coliseum was, where the dog chow factory was.
Yep.
They had like the stock show over there.
Yep.
It was the part of the highway where everybody would drive by and sort of plug their nose because it smelled terrible.
Yeah.
That was my neighborhood growing up.
Wow.
So
Okay.
it was fun for me to see that there was some brilliant Bible thinkers coming out of Denver. Made me really happy.
That's great.
So your book is outstanding. I read Bearing God's Name a long time ago at this point now, I guess relatively speaking. And then Being God's Image came out just recently.
Yep.
And I've gone through it 4 times on
audiobook. Wow. That's almost as many times as I have.
And you wrote it.
I did.
It's been extremely fruitful. It's super cool because I feel like it's a bit of a, it's operating on a lot of levels. I appreciated that it's doing, it's talking about, the subject, the subheadline is Why Creation Still Matters. And for my channel and what we're trying to do, it's all about how to live your life in light of what the Bible really says about eternity. What does the eternal state actually look like? A lot of people think it's nebulous. It really isn't. The Bible gives us so much to chew on.
Exactly.
And then we live in light of that today. And all of that is rooted in Genesis 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
So your book, I thoroughly appreciated its approach in that way. And I appreciated that it was really a biblical theology, right? It's starting from the Genesis 1 and 2 and tracing key themes and motifs all the way through until the end, and seeing how those all connect together. So how is it that I would really love to know, like, where did this kind of thinking come from? Why is it important to approach biblical scriptural study that way? What are some reasons you might want to do that rather than like a systematic theology that could be running the risk of picking and choosing? Why would we do it that way?
Yeah. So you mentioned Ray Lubeck. He was my probably first inspiration or first exposure to biblical theology. He was a professor of mine at Multnomah University, and I took a class with him on Old Testament biblical theology, and he asked us, just as one of our assignments, to come up with what is the center of Old Testament theology, like express it in a sentence. And that forced us to try to figure out, how can we say something that's true about the Old Testament that includes all of it without being super vague, like God is love. How can we say something that's specific, but also that accounts for all the data? And it was our big challenge that we were working on through the semester. And then we had a couple of other assignments where we had to choose a theme and trace it through the whole Bible. So the theme that I chose was the garden. And that was my first experience tracing from the Garden of Eden to the garden in the new creation, in the New Jerusalem. And I would have to say that assignment changed my life, because it was the first time I saw the way the Bible was working together as a unified story. I knew lots of stories. I was compelled that it was all scripture, but I hadn't ever traced a thread like that all the way through, and to see the richness. Now, not that every time we see the word garden, it's evoking all of this necessarily, but kind of to go back through and wrestle with it and see, how do all these things fit together? When is a passage echoing a previous passage and when is it not? That was really transformative for me. And Ray Lubeck's way of grading those assignments, we could only turn in one page front and back with all the data and all of our conclusions. So it forced us to synthesize and to express things clearly. And if he didn't like it, if he didn't think it was quite on point yet, he would just give it back to us and say, try again. I mean, he would, highlight or circle problems and make us work on it some more. And I see now what a great pedagogical tool that was, to keep us going back until we were satisfied. And then our final project for that class was to do some creative project that expressed what we learned. So I made a quilt, like a quilted wall hanging of the walls of the New Jerusalem with the garden in the middle. And that was a deeply formative experience, because I was getting a vision for the big picture. And I hadn't really thought, until you just asked me, I hadn't really thought about how that really was the backstory to this book. Even though that was back in 1996, 97, maybe. Probably 96, probably fall of 96. So that's a long time ago now, but was really, really transformative. So then when I was looking for a doctoral program later, many years later, it was important to me to find a program that didn't just slice and dice the scriptures, but that also helped see those themes. And so I found out about Wheaton College's program, and the degree is actually it's a PhD in biblical theology. So we spent 3 years reading all the Old Testament theologies and thinking about our projects, our individual projects, in terms of big themes. So it really trained me, or I had already had the initial foundation from Ray Lubeck, but it gave me a more methodological rigor about that process. And I think you see that over and over again in the Bible Project's work. Tim Mackey was in that class with me, that Old Testament biblical theology class. We were all sitting there
to be a fly on the wall
together. I know,
that would
right?
be so much fun.
It was an amazing class and an amazing group. And of that class, there are now professors of Hebrew Bible at Duke and Harvard, Nashotah House, the Bible Project, Biola. I'm probably missing a couple of schools, but it was just such an amazing, so the professor can only do so much. If the students aren't totally engaged, then there's only so much the professor can do to make the magic happen. And being in that class was magic because not only did we have an amazing educator, but we had an incredible cohort of students that pushed each other. And, it was the kind of thing where students wouldn't just switch topics right after class was over. They would walk out of class still wrestling and thinking about it and talking about it over lunch and late into the night. And then the next day, that's what they were still talking about. So I think that's probably where this all came from.
It's so tremendously interesting because you're 100% right. If people aren't completely bought in, then even the best teacher of really any kind can only do so much.
Yeah.
But I do find that there's something really interesting happens when people even get a glimpse of what the real story is.
Yes.
That it can sort of create that desire, and then they really want to know more. And I've seen people who would never consider themselves an academic. As soon as they discover that the story that I've had on repeat about what Christianity is, capital A, about, is maybe not the full picture, right?
Yeah, right.
They're thinking, I will die eventually, and then because Jesus paid for my sins, I will get to go up to heaven and sing to God forever.
That is at the bottom line of what I was trying to address or counteract in this book, was this very truncated view of the story, the biblical story, and our place in it. I wanted to help blow the sides of the box off and say, actually, the story doesn't start with you are a sinner. The story starts with you are made as God's image. You have inherent dignity and worth, and you are part of something much bigger than yourselves. So yes, we're a sinner. We stand in need of saving. I'm not denying that, but we need to turn back the clock all the way to the beginning to get the beginning of God's vision, and then see where it's all going. And where it's going, I'm convinced, you're convinced, is not a disembodied or nebulous existence, airy-fairy in the clouds, but is actually physical, embodied in the new creation.
I like to liken it to, imagine going to a theater to see a movie, and you're really excited about the movie, but you arrive 15 minutes late. So you miss the entire exposition and everything that's setting up all the plot conflict and all of the different, maybe the inciting incident. All of those things are just unknown to you.
Yep.
And then you go through the movie and you're kind of confused. You don't really know what's going on. So you decide to leave 15 minutes before the end. That's sort of the way that we read our Bibles. There's, 1,189 chapters in our Protestant Bible. And there's the first two chapters and the last two chapters have such outsized weight on what the story is about. And if we sort of start with a concept of humans that is, they're fundamentally broken, totally depraved sinners, and we don't go just a couple chapters before that becomes partial truth and say humans are also intended to be God's partners to rule over the world that he made and called good and take it someplace incredible.
Yes.
Together.
And that status has not been lost.
Right.
If we can recover that message, it changes everything.
Exactly so. So I was super encouraged as I read your book. My own, everything that I've tried to do with my book and everything I've tried to write and the videos that I put out, it is all about this subject. And I was extremely excited about it. I don't want to necessarily go through point by point what it is that you spoke about. Whatever I can say, I just recommend 100%, 10 out of 10. This book should be read by everybody who's serious about understanding the true biblical story and their role within it and what that should mean for what they do now. There are other cool interviews you could do with, that Carmen has done that you could go watch if you want to go see other conversations about that. What I wanted to do is dive really deep onto a few key ideas that are touched on in the book, but that maybe this could stand as almost like supplementary chapters, right? Where you and I are talking about things that didn't really get fleshed out quite the way we would like to.
Yeah.
And I would love to see what you have to say.
Sure.
Okay. So I like that you said made as God's image, not made in God's image. And I like that you're not using, because obviously this has been a discussion for many years. You touch on in the book how people say, for example, that you can image God, and they use image as a verb there,
Right.
which is tied to a function.
Right.
But that's not really the case of the biblical data, right? The biblical data seems to lend itself way more towards being a human simply is being a Tselem Elohim. It's being
Yes.
a physical manifestation or a representative of God himself
Yes.
to his created order,
Yes.
right? And then image gets fleshed out in other ideas too, where you know how you have prophets and priests and kings who all represent God to his creation in a different way, right? But most people who have a basic Christian background in the United States don't have any of those categories. Instead, they're thinking in terms of what makes humans different from, let's say, the animals is the immortal soul.
Yeah.
Like, that's usually what I'll hear in conversation with somebody who's got a basically conservative Christian background in the United States.
Yeah.
So what is, if you have to limit yourself to Old Testament, feel free to, because I know there's some changes when it gets to the New Testament. What is the Old Testament concept of the soul?
Yeah.
And why is that not what makes humans different from animals?
Yes. So I think you've set this up really well. I'll just add to your setup that just underscore, I think you kind of said this, is that so often when people talk about the image of God, they want to pour into that net or into that container everything that makes humans different from animals and say that's what it means to be the image of God. And I want to be more rigorous about saying, what does the Bible actually say about being the image of God? What does it mean? Not use that as a sort of catch-all for everything that makes us different. So are we different from animals? Absolutely. There are qualitative differences between us. And talking about the soul is one way people try to get at that. And I think there is some credence to the idea of our ability to have a spiritual connection with God is something that seems different than what the animals have. And that probably goes back to Genesis 2 when God breathes into Adam. That's probably what's communicating that we're getting something of God's essence within us that animate us. But I absolutely agree that that soul is not the best way to talk about what it means to be the image of God, because in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the word soul is nephesh. And there's a great Bible Project video on nephesh and what it means, which I love to show my students, because we think of soul as being, so nephesh is usually translated soul. We think of that as being the non-physical part of ourselves. But the Bible uses nephesh in many different ways, and it usually refers to the whole person, what we would consider body, soul, and spirit, or body and soul, depending on whether you're a dipartite or a tripartite theologian.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I don't know what I am on that. What I know is that from an Old Testament point of view, we are a soul, we are a nephesh, and nephesh includes our bodies. So it's not just the disembodied part of ourselves. I haven't done the same deep dive in Greek to see how that plays out. I was going to say how that fleshes out, but that might not be the right metaphor to use here. But I think you're right that there's a reading back into the Old Testament, Greek concepts of a difference between matter and non-material that we don't have in the Old Testament as clearly. And so I think it's important not to read backwards in that sense.
100% agreement. This was a piece of study that I underwent several years ago with the teens in my church.
Okay.
And we were looking at the word soul, and I pointed out that the first time that the word soul appears in the Bible, it's in Genesis 1, and it's not describing human beings, it's describing fish. You know, if you just open the book and you read from Genesis 1:1 onward, the first occurrence of the word nephesh is for sea creatures. God says, "Let the waters teem with living nephesh."
Oh, yes. Yes. Good.
And then second time that arrives, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'd love to hear what you have to say
so then
next.
that can't be the basis for our difference from animals.
Right.
Yeah. So we do have differences, but the difference is not nephesh.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So that was super interesting for me because there's a lot of, again, there's a lot of Greek thought that's tied into
Hmm.
the immortal soul being the thing that lives on in a non-material realm after you die.
Yep.
Um, that whether that's the good place or the bad place,
Hmm.
and all of that is Greek Platonic thinking. And I find that when you understand, first off, that the Old Testament isn't trafficking in those terms at all,
Hmm.
and then that the New Testament has its roots much more deeply in the Old Testament than it does in any Greek thought. In fact,
Right.
Paul will bring up Greek thought to critique it
Right.
more than to cite it as a reliable source.
Yep.
Then the image of the immortal soul becomes something that doesn't really pass muster biblically speaking. You can't really make a biblical case for it.
Right. The
So
idea that
so
our
mhm,
non-material self lives forever and our physical self doesn't. Or that the physical self
right.
is like a shell to be discarded so that the non-material part of ourself can persist forever. Yeah, these are not biblical concepts.
No, in fact, and this is what was so interesting because you point this out several times in the book, that the physicality of a human being is assumed and doesn't show up often in the way that we translate things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the word nephesh, which again is the whole embodied self, the whole person,
Yeah.
is so often just translated me
Yes,
or my
especially in the
life.
Psalms, because nephesh
Exactly.
ends up being the fancy poetic way of saying me or I. My nephesh is like a more
Hmm.
poetic way of referring to myself. And yes,
Hmm.
it's not talking about my inner self as opposed to my body. It's just saying me.
Hmm. Because both of those things is me,
Yeah.
right? There's maybe some other person, maybe you're the person to talk about this, maybe not, but the concepts of the different attributes of God that are also themselves identities of God, right? Where
Mm,
something is God, but it's distinct from God. You have like the word of the Lord in the Old Testament
mm,
acts as a
hmm.
character in certain scenes, or
Yeah.
the angel of the Lord, or God's glory is its own character
Yeah.
and acts in certain ways.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something similar where there's a human, and then there's the physical part of the human, and then there's also the spiritual part of the human. But both of those could rightly be called human.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Maybe there's relationship there.
I don't have training, just to be really clear, I don't have training in metaphysics. And so I have friends who do, who are like it's very important to them to use very nuanced and careful language about this. So one of my
Mm-hmm.
friends would argue, I am not my body. There is something
Mm-hmm.
different. I can talk about my hand in a way that
Mm-hmm.
like I have a consciousness that's outside my body. So I want to acknowledge, yes, that's true. I think we can all attest to that. But if we drill down to how does the Old Testament talk about human personhood and how does it describe us as the image of God, it's very clear that it's something physical. That the word selim used to describe humans as the image, that word is very concrete. It's not referring to a an intangible similarity between us and God, but it's our physical embodiment, because an image is a statue or idol of a deity that makes obvious its presence. So as an idol of a god is supposed to represent that God's presence in a particular location, and similarly God makes humans as his image so that we can represent his presence on the earth. So what I like to say is that every human being is the image of God. The only qualification for being the image of God is human embodiment. You don't have to have a certain set of capabilities uh, or personality traits or character traits or functions. It's just built into who you are. As soon as you have a body, you are a human made as God's image. And I'll just hasten to say, because I can hear my metaphysicist friend in the background warning that what I'm not saying, I'm not a physicalist. Apparently that's a thing where some
Yes.
people think that we're only physical, there's nothing immaterial, and I'm not that. But I just want to see the unity that the Old Testament sees in our nephesh.
That's, yeah, 100%. Yeah, I have friends who are of a similar discipline who, they would call that like a physical essentialism or like a
Okay.
physical reductionism,
Yeah.
where it's trying to reduce. They would use big words like epiphenomena of the mind or of things that would be, emotional, down to simple physical chemical processes. That
Yeah.
would be what a physicalist would be saying.
And
that's not really the claim. Yeah.
And that's
not
that's a different
claim.
question than the question I'm trying to answer. I'm trying to say, what does the Bible say that it means to be the image of God? So this isn't meant to be the sum total of all that we can know about human personhood, but all that the Bible is trying to communicate about human personhood in these terms. So I'll also say I'm not a trained classicist. So when you ask about Greek philosophy and the influence of Greek philosophy on Christian thought, I can see it. I'm probably not the expert at naming it, but I see it all the time, this sort of pouring back into the Old Testament, later categories of thought that aren't really appropriate, that it's anachronistic to do that. And so I want to be careful that we don't separate body and spirit or body and soul in ways that Plato wanted to do later.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I don't think you have to have too much training to see the influence, but it's good to be careful with our categories and be really mindful of our speech and the way that we're presenting things so that we don't misrepresent. Yeah.
Totally. Having a doctorate, sometimes people assume that if you have a doctorate, you're an expert on anything you open your mouth about. That is, in fact, not the case, which my family will attest to. Mom is not an expert in everything. So I just wanted to be clear about my training is Hebrew Bible. That's where I've landed.
Completely. But what is clear, I think, and you do such a good job of articulating this in the book, is that human personhood, being an image, a little idol statue, a little statue of God running around the creation, necessarily implies physicality.
Yep.
And it's not something to be excluded from what it means to be human, as though it's sort of as though it's sort of an artifact, a secondary artifact of being a human. It's core to what being human means, and it's core to what God intended when he created them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that has all kinds of implications for ethics. Once we land on this truth that our bodies matter, that they're God-given, and that they're part of who we are, then that has all sorts of, trails we could walk down.
This is exactly where I kind of wanted to go next. This becomes a really interesting discussion. It's like, okay, well, when does it become a human body? At what point in its, gestation and development? At what point does it become a human body? There are lots of arbitrary lines you can draw where you'd be saying, okay, maybe it's you wait until there's heartbeat that you can notice in utero. Maybe there's when there's brain activity. Right. Some people would want to wait until it's, they'll say fully independent, even though all humans are dependent all the time.
And
want to wait until
infants especially so. I mean, what infant is not dependent? An infant is not born able to feed itself and nourish itself and clean up after itself, as every parent knows very well. And so, yes, this is such an interesting question to then return to with this in mind. If the Bible says we are the image of God because we have bodies, we're embodied, therefore we are the image of God, then we no longer need to look for a specific capacity that qualifies us to be the image of God. And so if, the majority of people who are talking about the image of God are attaching it or defining it as a certain capacity. And probably one of the most common ways people define it is rationality. Humans are more rational than animals. We're rational beings, therefore we're the image of God. And if you define it as rationality, then you could look at the gestational development and wait for a certain moment of insight. But then how would you define that exactly? So is it when the infant, the unborn child, preborn child can feel pain? Is it when they are self-aware? Because I saw a baby the other day who was clearly not aware that his hands were connected to his arms and that he had control over them. They were still flopping all over the place. It takes months and months for babies to figure out this hand is my hand and I can make it do things to get what I want. And you are not, I can't make you do things the way that I can make me do things. And so it takes time. So then would we say that a child under 1 year of age is not the image of God because they don't have full rational capacities? I mean, at what point, I've got teenagers, 12 to 14 years old, and they're still figuring out they say you don't develop your prefrontal cortex till like 24. And so does that mean none of my children are full-fledged human beings made as God's image? And I would say no, categorically no. The Bible teaches that every human is the image of God. And so I would say we could roll back the clock to the very moment when the sperm of your father and the egg of your mother met in a fallopian tube somewhere and began multiplying, because that's a body.
You have two gametes that form a zygote with unique DNA structure.
Yeah.
And then from that moment on, it's a unique, distinct human being, and they don't use the word image necessarily when we're going through, for example, the Psalms. And this is even incidental to the point of what most of these Psalms are trying to communicate, but they will locate a person's initial life spark in the womb. They'll say, David would say, almost casually, as though he's taking this truth for granted, that he was sinful from when he was in the womb.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And there's a sort of an idiom that he's using there. And, the point isn't, he's not trying to communicate something about when life exists, but in communicating what he does communicate, he incidentally claims that that's when life begins.
Right. How far can we roll back the clock? We can roll it right back to that moment of conception. And God does this with Jeremiah as well. Does it even say before you were in the womb?
Yes.
Okay. So that's a different thing.
That's the fun part.
The fun part about that is that it's telling us that Jeremiah is not self-determined. His identity is given by God. And that's what I think is a huge takeaway for, say, the student population that I'm working with. I mainly teach 18 to 22-year-olds who are in this process of identity discovery and formation. And many of them feel like they're under a lot of pressure to determine their path for life. And who am I? And there are all sorts of options now for who am I that didn't even used to be options. And so there's a lot of accompanying pressure to figure out who I am. And the Bible reaches into that conversation and says, you are who God says you are. Your identity is given by God. It's you were born in the heart of God. Your who you are, your personhood came from outside of yourself and was given to you. So that is tremendously countercultural, because we like to be independent and self-determined and self-actualized and all of that.
100%. And this leads neatly into conversations and questions about calling and work and what we choose to spend our efforts on and what actually matters for eternity and what doesn't matter for eternity. But just to tie a bow really neatly on what we just discussed, personhood is, the image of God, which I've completed with personhood unhelpfully, sorry, but being the image of God begins at conception. Yes. And that seems to be the best, most consistent, most reasonable place to locate the beginning of a person's personhood and image of Godness.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Cool. Regardless of whether they end up to be someone with profound disabilities, regardless of their gender, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of any other, we would call them an immutable characteristic of their personhood, regardless of what those developmental qualities end up being, it's simply the moment of there's distinct genetic code that marks the beginning of a new unit of a human being. And that's when image of God is conferred.
Yep. And it would persist then all the way until death. So that in your later years of life, this week I had an opportunity to speak to an adult Sunday school class where probably the average age in the room was upper 80s. And so many of them were single again, having lost their spouse. Many of them were dealing with difficulties of mobility or hearing. Some of them, one of the prayer requests they shared was about one of their members who seems to be confused and is experiencing dementia. And I was able to say to them, what this means for you in this stage of your life is that you can let go of the worry that if you start to lose your memory, your personhood will be lost, because your sense of self is held for you by God. It's not up to you to maintain it. And so you can begin to forget who you are, but that's okay, because God knows who you are and he's holding that for you. And so we never come to a point in life where we've outlived our value or outlived our dignity. Because our value and dignity are not attached to what we're able to think. They're not attached to what we're able to do. And so when you can do less and when your thinking faculties begin to wane, you are still every bit as valuable as you were, which then it's like the bookend to the conversation about abortion is euthanasia. Like, do we get to the point where we'd be better off dead? And I think the Bible is really clear in Genesis 9:6 that we're not to take the life of a human being, because every human is God's image. And so I'm saying from conception and to death, you have value and dignity that are worth preserving.
Yeah, that's one of them. And it's honestly, there are only very few instances in the Old Testament where the phrase is used again after Genesis 1 and 2. And that's one of them.
Yep.
So that's a profoundly interesting application of it. So then this leads, I would say neatly, I want to get to calling and work and all of those things, but I kind of want to go to the end of the story first and then build a bridge back to today. Because I think that's probably that's Paul's logic in a lot of his letters, is thinking through, okay, you are this person that God has redeemed. You are seated with Christ in the heavenlies. So live that out in your day-to-day life. And this is what it looks like in community. But in terms of resurrection then, so what is the difference in nature, especially when it comes to like image of God quality, between our birth to death image of God in habitation in the fallen world, and then in the resurrected state, what is the difference in quality of image of God? Is it the same thing, but now it's just a glorified rendition of it? Obviously, Jesus himself is called the image of God, where it's like that definite article.
Yep.
How do those ideas all work together?
So I don't think there's a difference between image of God before we're raised in the resurrection and after. Like, I think our life on earth, we're the image of God. And in the resurrection, we're the image of God. I don't think there's a difference in the Imago Dei itself, but definitely there's a difference in glory. And I think glory is the best way of describing what was lost at the fall. I don't believe that the Bible teaches that we lost the image or that it was diminished in any way because of Genesis 9:6 reaffirming that every human's the image of God. That's why you can't kill each other. So I would say that what's wrong when we look out at the world and say, but surely you'd say something is wrong. we're not who we're supposed to be. I would agree that, and the way I would describe it is we are the image of God, but sometimes we live according to a lie and we fail to live in alignment with our true identity. We live according to other versions of reality. We live into other stories that explain why we're here and what we're for. And so what's missing then is the glory. That's what gets diminished. And I think that's what gets restored in the new creation. The New Testament talks about us being conformed to the image of Christ. And I want to insist that Jesus is the image of God, not because he's God, but because he's human. And some people will say only Jesus is the image of God, and the rest of us are tagging along and hoping and aspiring to be the image of God. And I don't think that works theologically, with respect to all those out there who I know are doing good work and have drawn other conclusions. I would say that Jesus is the image of God because he's human, and we see in him all the glory that's supposed to go with that Jesus is living congruently with his identity. And so he shows us how to do that. And so we're conformed to his image. We follow his modeling of how to be God's image. He lives out his vocation in a way that's fully appropriate, and we're supposed to follow his lead in that. So yes, there is a restoration of glory or an increase of glory, but I don't think there's any increase of image.
That's a really helpful way of articulating this, because I was wrestling through this years ago too. My father passed away in 2018 to lung and liver cancer, and he in the final days, it was very quick. As I understand, as cancers go, it was about as painless an experience as it can be. It was about a month of real experiencing of symptoms, which had meant that it was obviously really advanced by the time that he started to actually suffer from it. It was stage 4. We had no idea. But I was reading a book called All Things New by John Eldredge. And, John is not what you would call an academic. He's not someone who has, done the really hard work of going into the Hebrew and Greek, but he's a very heartfelt, wise, experienced counselor of a believer. And this book is all about, how the hope of new creation is what the hope of Christianity really is, and how that ought to change the way that we think about things today. And I was thinking about these ideas of image of God as my father's health started to really deteriorate. And in studying it, and what I came away with, what my understanding was, is that image of God is really an unassailable baseline fact of humanness. There's nothing that can remove that from a person at all.
Right.
It simply is contemporaneous, I guess would be the word. It's part and parcel of being human in any form, in any state, at any stage.
Yep.
But my thought was, my dad looks like a shadow of himself, and it reminded me poignantly. I had also listened to Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright years before that. Another incredible work. But he says that our existence today in this life under the curse of sin is almost like we're a shadow of our future selves. Right? So he's picking up on, C.S. Lewis has this idea of heaven being a more substantive, more weighty, and that kind of deals with like glory as a term in the Hebrew Bible too.
Yep.
So it's exciting for me, because if you believe that Christianity is true and you believe its truth claims, then you should understand that what we're heading toward then would be a more physically embodied, more weighty existence in a new world where there's no suppression from the curse or sin or death in existence anywhere in the universe.
That's right. Yep.
And it's extremely exciting.
Yes, it's very
this
exciting.
Leads into, it is super exciting. And this is what I really wanted to dive into, is, if you think about our embodied existence, if we're lucky, we get 80 years, right? Maybe a little bit more than that.
Yep.
But that's around what amount of time we can expect if we don't die earlier in our lives due to unforeseen circumstances.
Right.
And that's this tiny infinitesimal blip. But there will come a day when we've had hundreds of thousands, and then millions, and billions and trillions, if you follow the logic of years of existence in a new glorified body. So I think it's much more interesting to try to locate what can we learn about that experience, and what does the Bible teach us there. So I wanted to ask you, there are different lines of thought on this. Michael Heiser, who, may God rest his soul. I know he's in much better shape than any of us is right now.
Yes.
He likes to say he talks about glorification as becoming as close to Jesus is in his glorified state as possible without also becoming a member of the Godhead. That's how he tries to articulate glorification. My Lutheran friends would talk about, I believe it is the theosis, concept. So when you talk about a glorified body, what are some of the, properties that you would think that would take from a biblical perspective?
Yeah. So this is where we move into the area of speculation because we have a very limited data set. And that is, we have Jesus' resurrected body, and we see what he can do and what's true about his body. And then we can extrapolate from that to make assumptions about our body. Now, I heard just a few days ago that some people think Jesus' resurrection body is not a model for our new creation body because he hadn't ascended yet. So there's another whole layer of transformation that awaits him when he appears to his disciples. I don't know. I hadn't considered that. What I know is when he rises from the dead, he still eats or is able to eat. So it's still a body that can ingest material and receive nourishment from it. We know that he has scars. So there's a sense of continuity between his earthly body and his resurrection body, in that the things that happen to him on earth are still visible. So that opens up the question of whether all scars will still be present in our new creation bodies, or whether only the scar, I've heard people say only the wounds of love will persist. So then it's a question, will I still have my incision from my C-section? Will I still have the scar on my toe where I cut my foot as a child trying to help my neighbor? Will I still have the place where my birthmark was removed from my back? Will you still be able to see the zigzag? Like, that wasn't a wound of love. That was just a precautionary, make sure this doesn't turn into cancer. So I don't know. Will I still have a tattoo in the new creation? Will all tattoos still be around, or only those that are consistent with our Christian testimony and our identity in Christ? If the latter, then I'll still have this one because it says belonging to Yahweh, and that will still be true. But maybe some of the sillier ones will disappear, or the rebellious ones. I don't know. All I can do is speculate based on this very limited data set that Jesus has scars. If there's anything I've gotten pushback from about this book, it's this area, this question, because I also speculate in the book about what happens to disabled bodies in the new creation.
That was where I was going next.
Yes, I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer to this, but I think it's worth speculating about. It's interesting. It's an interesting thought experiment because of Jesus' scars. And I have friends with disability who fall across the spectrum, some of them who are like, I better get a new body. I better be healed. I don't want these limitations anymore in the new creation. And I have other friends who say, I honestly don't know who I'd be without this disability. And I expect that my new creation body will not experience pain. It won't be a source of angst, but I don't know that my limbs will all be straight and I'll be able to walk and run. Because if I did, then who would I be? What would be unique about me? And so I think it's worth at least toying with the idea, because for most of my life, I would say 44 out of my 46 years, I just assumed that people that I knew who are wheelchair users would be skipping and jumping in heaven or in the new creation. And I am no longer positive about that, not because I doubt God's ability to heal. Obviously, God can heal. But I wonder if the healing that will happen in the new creation will be a healing of our community, so that the barriers and limitations of disability will be removed, not the disabilities themselves. I wonder whether we'll actually be so accepting of each other and so interdependent on each other that the disabilities won't be experienced as problems in the same way that they are now. And so that new thinking for me has come about as a result of a couple of factors. One is studying Exodus and seeing the story of Moses and his speech impediment in chapter 3 and 4. God reassures Moses, I made your mouth. I made you this way, and I know what I'm doing. And so if this was, he doesn't indicate like, this is because you live in a broken and fallen world. God talks about disability in that passage as if it was his idea. So that was the first thing that really challenged me. And then the other factor is, as I worked on the book, I became more and more aware of how persistent this image of the ideal person in our minds is: an able-bodied, middle-aged, successful male individual, white, and how much that's a lie. Like that if every human being is the image of God, then we fall along a diverse spectrum of personalities, abilities, and disabilities, and that we're not intended to be self-sufficient. We're intended to be interdependent. And sometimes this ideal of healing the disabled body is an ideal that has centered the idea of independence and self-sufficiency in a way that I think is not biblical. So I am not here saying,
web to untie.
It is. I am not here to say, I know this is how it's going to be in the new creation, but I am here to say, we should interrogate our assumptions about how it will be and why we think it will be that way, because it might in the process uncover some lies that we're believing about what it means to be human.
Excellently stated. Yeah, the nuance here is where it makes so much room for interesting discussion. I've heard people sort of locate the healing concept back into Jesus's own miraculous healings,
Sure.
right? Where someone who had an eye that was intended to be able to do something is then not able to do it for some reason. And in some cases, it's, they were born that way and there's no reason given. In other times, it's so that the works of God might be made manifest, like the blind beggar,
Right.
And then the healing is then to be made an illustration of the kingdom of God coming, right? It's present, it's here, and it has this healing power to restore something that was intended and designed for a purpose: an eye to see, ears to hear, bodies to not bleed too much, and then legs to walk. But when I read that in your book, it just hit me. I was like, what are the things that we assume are broken that are just being human, right?
Yes.
Like, most of us are conditioned to think that having too much fat on your body, we have an idea of what too much fat is. And there's actually an amount that's healthy.
Yep.
And there are problems that arise in both men and women when you go below a certain percentage,
right,
that we would think is more aesthetically pleasing.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're not all going to necessarily be, bodybuilders with 6-pack abs and tans in the new creation.
No.
We're just going to have a body that has no actual faults, whatever that means. So then it's this process of like parsing out, what is it that's actually a fault and a flaw and actual brokenness that will be healed, and what is it that is just something that I dislike because of my cultural context.
Right.
It's really interesting
because of a self-image that needs to be healed. And
right.
And we actually fall along a whole spectrum of sizes and body shapes and abilities, and we go throughout the course of our lifetime. We move in and out of seasons of being able to do things, right? So young children can sometimes do the splits and then can't anymore by the time they're in their 20s or 30s. And now by the time you're my age, it's a little hard to paint your toenails. Right? Like, okay, this is getting harder. So we move in and out of seasons of ability, and and some people experience persistent disability through the whole span of their life. And I think we would do well to begin to appreciate the complexity and diversity of human experience, and not see our failure, or not see our limitations as a problem, but our limitations as a feature. Kelly Kapick's new book, You're Only Human, is a really good exploration of human limitations. I just saw a podcast interview with him in which they titled it, Kelly Kapick Has Limits, or something like that. I thought that was clever.
Yeah.
Because he is trying to lean into it's okay to have limits. It's actually good, because when I'm limited, then I discover I need others. I can't do everything all by myself.
Exactly. Yeah. What we should affirm regardless as well is just to reiterate and maybe place more emphasis on someone who has something that they would consider is a limitation that you would blame on brokenness and sin and the curse. Even that person, there's nothing that has been done to their image of godness.
Right. Right.
It's a re-emphasis of, you are as valuable and as worthwhile and as important to God as something that he made and called good.
Yes.
And you represent him regardless of what you like or don't like about your body, and what state, what is the cause of those pieces of your body that you don't like, being the way that they are. Regardless of any of that, there's nothing that will assail your nature as the image of God.
Exactly.
Super interesting. So we're coming up on like 58 minutes, almost an hour. I have a couple of things I wanted to just talk about briefly, if we could.
Great. Yep.
And it's the idea of vocation and calling. A lot of that's one of the things. The other thing will be, what are the first three things you want to do in the new creation? And we'll get to that. But when it comes to calling and vocation and what we do with the time and energy that is given to us, what are the eternal valuable things on which to spend that time?
Mm-hmm.
Small questions like this.
Yes, right.
Things you could just, a cup of tea by the fireplace for a couple hours and you'll have that solved.
Oh, right. Of course.
The way I would want to boil this down to make it not such a massive thing is, how does our understanding of what we do now change because our eternal state reflects the physicality of our current state? Like,
yes.
A lot of people will think, because I'm going to get airlifted to heaven eventually, and my eternal state is going to be singing to God in a nebulous, non-physical realm forever.
Yeah.
However you make all that work, they tend to devalue the secular things that they do now, and they tend to overvalue sort of a Platonized sacred things that I do.
Sure.
Right? Or they'll locate the value of real work on the shoulders of pastors and missionaries and evangelists, rather than on accountants and police officers and bookkeepers and designers.
Right.
So what changes about the way that we should look at vocation and work and calling and things like that, because our eternal state is physically embodied as well?
Yeah. I mean, the subtitle of the book is Why Creation Still Matters. And I would say that when you drill down in Genesis 1 about to the question of what is the image of God, you find out it's human identity, but immediately God says, so humans are the image of God so that they may rule. And so there's an attendant vocation that comes along. It's a package deal. And so that's, I think, what we're talking about when we say that the image has been lost. We see people not doing this vocation. But I want to just separate between the identity and the vocation long enough so that we understand that a disability can't disqualify you, your age doesn't disqualify you, all of that. And so the vocation of humans from the beginning is to rule over creation. That is to maintain order, to create spaces for flourishing, to contribute to creativity and kingdom building activities in whatever ways are not exploitative or domineering or whatever. So humans are supposed to rule creation, but not each other. We're supposed to be side by side as partners doing this work. And when you have that piece in place, and then you notice that Jesus comes in the flesh, his incarnation is enfleshed. He rises from the dead in his body. He ascends in his body, and he announces the new creation. Then we discover, that thing that God told Adam and Eve to do in the garden is still going to be in effect in the new creation. Like, creation still matters, not just now, but for eternity. This planet actually matters. And so our investment in human institutions, in politics, in the economy, in education, in creation care, like actual taking care of the environment. All of these things are ways of living out our human vocation. And so we need to practice doing those things in a way that brings honor to God and is consistent with where this is all going. If we don't think of this world as something that's going to just go up in flames, then the ways that we manage these resources matters. So we're recording this on the 5th of July. It was kind of a big holiday yesterday. Lots of people blowing things up all over the place. And we had 15,000 people descend on our local park to watch fireworks. And on my walk to work this morning, I saw a lot more trash than usual. And I typically don't look at that as, boy, somebody should get over here and do their job. What I think is, on my way home, I need to take a plastic bag with me so that I can fill it up with all of this trash because it's my job. I'm human. Mm-hmm. I've been given the dominion over creation. This is my corner of the world. I walk past it every day. Therefore, I should be the one reaching down and picking up the trash. And that is not a distraction from my calling in ministry. That is part of my human vocation.
Mm-hmm. it's part and parcel with it.
Yes.
That is so very different.
Mhm.
I could go deeper on that. That's very different from what most of my, we'll call them conservative Christian friends, have in mind when they think about the calling of a human being and what
Yeah.
humans were made for,
Yes.
in terms of creation care. There's a weird sort of a conflation of a certain political ideology
Yep.
and a skepticism
Yep.
around environmentalist causes and things like that.
And I grew
Um,
up in Denver, as you did as well. And I don't know if it's true everywhere, but in my growing up context, people who cared too much about the environment were people we suspected. They
mhm.
were off by a few degrees because they didn't care about the real thing that matters, which is the disembodied souls of our neighbors. And and I just want to say that as I go back to scripture and look at the teaching about what does it mean to be human, I see creation care as absolutely central to what it means. I don't understand how we ever got to the place where it didn't matter, or whether that was peripheral and we don't need to worry about it.
It's so interesting because when we really take God at his word and we read this and we really start to parse out how do these things walk out in shoe leather? How do we actually
Mm-hmm.
put this stuff to work? I think that, and this is just a suspicion I have, but you can tell me what you think too. I suspect that a watching world of unbelievers who
Mm-hmm.
have an intuitive sense that the physical created world matters
Mm-hmm.
and it should be taken care of, and
Yep.
we should be taking care of other people. Goodness knows where they got this idea. I have no idea, but who have this general sense that the created world matters, whether they would use those terms or not. They look around and they want to protect the environment. They care about animals. They care about animal
Yeah.
rights. They care about the rights of disenfranchised human beings.
Yeah.
If there's a if we were to embody not just a moral philosophy, but a way of life that also elevates those things on the
Mm-hmm.
basis that God also wants to see them elevated and cared for,
Yep.
I wonder how much more attractive the good news would be that God is
Totally.
king over this place.
Yep.
How much
Yeah.
more winsome it would sound to people who, if we actually value what God values,
Yep.
and I think that humans have an intuitive sense to value those things, even though it's twisted and marred and shaped by all sorts of other, like
Yeah.
you said, lies and stories that we shouldn't be leaning into and believing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wonder how much more winsome the gospel would sound to people if it were truly embodied in our lives the way that God seems to, what God actually prioritizes
Yep.
and seems to care about on the pages of scripture.
Totally.
Just
I
a thought.
agree. Yep, I totally agree. And I actually end the book with a 2-page redo of how should we share the gospel, because
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the hesitancy that people have about caring for the planet comes from the way that we've embraced a gospel message that was truncated. We've said, I want to ask Jesus into my heart to pay for my sin so I can go to heaven when I die. That story has nothing to do with this created world. And so I don't see my vocation as part of it. But if we invited people into a living relationship with the God who created them as his image, and if they're becoming part of God's family, his royal family, and given dominion over this earth, and that's part of the gospel message, then it matters how we clean up our neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. I have to share this one little motif before I get to that last question. This one little
Sure.
thing that kept coming up for me as I was listening, because I almost exclusively listen to books.
Mm-hmm.
I read them as well, but it's just a lot easier for me to be able to multitask and let something sort of sneak past my inhibitions down into my subconscious
Yeah.
if I listen to it.
Yeah.
And then I can do a book like yours 4 or 5 times and really get to riff on different things and listen for different cues. So I would go to the gym, or I'd go to the grocery store, or I'd be driving and I'd be listening to your book, and I would unconsciously find myself just vigorously nodding my head and sort of subvocally saying yes, like yes. But when I got to the end and I got to that little section where you're talking about a revised way of presenting the gospel, I was driving in my car and I was listening to it, and I had my windows down because it was a hot day here in Fort Collins, and I was very certain that I was alone or that no one was paying attention. And I was wrong about that. But I let out a really effusive God, yes. And then I didn't have it on the speakers. It was my earphones, right? And then I just look over and there's a person who's like, okay, I wonder what he's listening to.
It's the gospel, man.
It's the good news. It's the good news that God is king over this place, that he created it for a purpose. He created all humans for a purpose, that he's coming back to restore that purpose. And you're invited to participate in it if you abandon the rebel kingdoms and join the kingdom of Jesus, right?
Amen.
And it's extremely invigorating and life-giving.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So thank you for your contribution to that. Your book was incredible. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I will continue to enjoy it. I've got lots of other stuff I want to go through and take notes on. But one last question, and it's the hardest one I think I've found for people who are basically thoughtful. I teed you up with it earlier.
Yep.
What are, after the feast, however you parse that, maybe the feast is ongoing, whatever. After the feast, after, whatever ceremonies, righting of wrongs, whatever other things make up the God has exacted justice and created righteousness. As far as the eye can see, as far as the curse is found, the entire created order is restored, redeemed. And then we sort of step out of the gates of the city into a world full of potential, ready to be taken in the direction that God intended for it to be taken when he first commissioned humans.
Yeah.
What are the first three things that you do in the new creation?
I find a great fruit tree and try the fruit. I track down either Moses or Paul. I mean, it would really be great if I could find them both and we could just sit down and have a heart-to-heart, all three of us. I'm convinced that people think the two of them would not get along, and I'm convinced that Paul and Moses are actually on the same page. So I'd like to just actually confirm that and have a heart-to-heart. And then I don't know. I feel like I want to go on a really great hike with some great companions. I love being out in nature, and I feel like when the earth is all, I mean, it's amazing now. So when it's all restored, how gorgeous will it be?
It's a fantastic answer. I have almost the exact same one.
Nice.
It's like, I wonder what the tree of life tastes like, the fruit from the tree of life, whether that's literal or not.
Yep.
If it is literal, I'm sure going to want to try it.
Yep.
A fun thing about, I had this thought the other day about spending time with Moses and Paul. And I don't know if they would ever want to spend time with me. Maybe they're so charitable.
They've got forever. so.
Right, exactly. Maybe they've got such a restored and glorified level of love that they would be willing to spend a bunch of time with me. But technically, if we have eternity and it's infinite, I could actually spend infinite time with each of them.
Oh, sure.
When it comes to Moses and Paul.
And
theoretically, if they wanted to.
And because it's the new creation and all the lies have burned away, they would not see you as any less. If either of them had an arrogance issue, it would be gone. So they would be delighted to spend the day with you.
Sounds like heaven. Scratch that. It sounds like the new creation. And as far as hikes go, I wanted to share this photo here is from Aspen, Colorado.
That's amazing.
It is literally it's a place called the Maroon Bells out here in Denver.
I've been there.
If you're looking for a good hike and you're ever back in the area, I can't recommend the Maroon Bells enough. It was gorgeous.
Man, that was a great picture.
But I'm with you 100%. Just being out in the created order, and especially as beautiful as it is now, I can't fathom what it would look like in a glorified state, but I'm excited to find out.
I'd love to do the walk with Jesus, like do the hike with Jesus and be able to ask him, like, how did you think up that one? And yes. I'm convinced that we'll have all eternity to keep learning, and there's so much I want to ask. So
100%. Yes, completely agreed. Well, it's been nothing short of a pleasure. This has been super illuminating and super fun. I'm really grateful that you are going to be in eternity, because there are going to be even more questions I'm going to want to ask you.
I'll have all the time in the world to chat.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate it. Where can people go? Where would you ideally direct people? Obviously, your book is Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters.
Yep.
Where would you prefer people go if they wanted to learn more about your ministry, about your book, about your teaching? If they wanted to find out more about Carmen Imes, where would they go?
Probably the two one-stop shopping places. Actually, if there's two, then it's not one stop. Anyway, is my YouTube channel, which is where I keep video libraries of all the conversations like this one and all the lectures that I've given and I make weekly videos called Torah Tuesday that people can check out. So that would be a great place to find all the video content. And then I try to keep a running list on my blog of any other content around the web, plus any books that I write or contribute to. My blog is carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com.
Outstanding. Yeah, those Torah Tuesday videos are outstanding. And whenever you have conversations with your daughter as well, it's always really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I will add one to the list that I will recommend highly to people, which is your Exodus class for BibleProject Classroom.
Yes. That's a good
spot. Mind-bending left and right.
Nice. Yeah, that was really fun to record. It's 14 and a half hours of content that you can find over at thebibleproject.com //classroom.
I just say slash.
Click on slash. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, yep. Right. Just know which one to push. And
click on Classroom and you'll see my class on Exodus, and it's free because other people paid for it. So